So I'm just going to go by what our Natabar Gauranga has listed as, let's see, what verse is this number actually? 34. Did you do 33 yesterday, Ramroy?
34 through 36.
Yeah, 34 through 36. That's what I have listed down too. I'm going to read the first two verses since they have no purport, and then we'll do a responsive on the 36, 3.5.36. Anilo pi vikurvano nabhasoru balanvitaha sasarja rupa Tan-Matram jyotirlokasya lokchanam. And the translation reads, thereafter, the extremely powerful air interacting with the sky generated the form of sense perception, and the perception of form transformed into electricity, the light to see the world. Here is 35. Anilenan vitam jyotir vikurvat paravikshitam adhatambo rasamaham kala mayang shayogataha. When electricity was surcharged in the air and was glanced over by the Supreme at that time, by a mixture of eternal time and external energy, there occurred the creation of water and taste. So here's the one we're actually going to do responsively. Jyotishambho nusam shrushtang Jyotishambho nusam shrushtang Vikurvad brahma vikshitam Vikurvad brahma vikshitam Mahim ganda gunam adhat Mahim ganda gunam adhat Kala mayang shayogataha Kala mayang shayogataha Yotishambho nusam shrushtang Vikurvad brahma vikshitam Mahim gandha gunam adhat Kala mayang shayogataha Jyotishambho nusam shrushtang Vikurvat brahma vikshitam Mahim gandha gunam adhat Kala mayang shagogataha Jyotishambho nusam shrushtang Vikurvat brahma vikshitam Mahim gandha gunam adhat Kala mayam shayogataha Jyotishambho nusam shrushtang Vikurvad brahma vikshitam Mahim gandha gunam adhat Kala mayam shayogataha. Ladies. Jyotishambho nusam shrustam Vikurvad brahma vikshitam Mahim gandha gunam adhat Kala mayam shayogataha. Jyotisha, electricity. Ambaha, water. Anusam shrustam, thus created. Vikurvat, due to transformation. Brahma, the Supreme. Vikshitam, so glanced over. Mahim, the earth. Gandha, smell. Gunam, qualification. Adhat was created. Kala, eternal time. Maya, external energy. Amsha, partially. Yogataha, by intermixture. So the translation is as follows. Thereafter, the water produced from electricity was glanced over by the Supreme Personality of Godhead and mixed with eternal time and external energy. Thus, it was transformed into the earth, which is qualified primarily by smell. So I say, and you please repeat, thereafter the water produced from electricity was glanced over by the Supreme Personality of Godhead and mixed with eternal time and external energy. Thus it was transformed into the earth, which is qualified primarily by smell. So here is Prabhupada's purport. From the descriptions of the physical elements in the above verses, it is clear that in all stages the glance of the Supreme is needed with the other additions and alterations. In every transformation, the last finishing touch is the glance of the Lord, who acts as a painter does when he mixes different colors to transform them into a particular color. When one element mixes with another, the number of its qualities increases. For example, the sky is the cause of air. The sky has only one quality, namely sound. But by the interaction of the sky with the glance of the Lord mixed with eternal time and external nature, air is produced, which has two qualities, sound and touch. Similarly, after air is created, interaction of sky and air touched by time and the external energy of the Lord produces electricity. And after the interaction of electricity with air and sky, mixed with time, external energy in the Lord's glance over them, the water is produced. In the final stage of sky, there is one quality, namely sound. In air, two qualities, sound and touch. In electricity, three qualities, sound, touch, and form. In water, four qualities, sound, touch, form, and taste. And the last stage of physical development, the result is earth, which has all five qualities, sound, touch, form, taste, and smell. Although they were different mixtures of different materials, such mixtures do not take place automatically. Just as a mixture of colors does not take place automatically without the touch of the living painter. The automatic system is factually activated by the glancing touch of the Lord. Living consciousness is the final word in all physical changes. This fact is mentioned in Bhagavad Gita 9.10 as follows: Maya dakshena prakriti suyate sacharacharam hetu nanena konteya jagad viparyavartate. The conclusion is that the physical elements may work very wonderfully to the layman's eyes, but their workings actually take place under the supervision of the Lord. Those who can mark only the changes of physical elements and cannot perceive the hidden hand of the Lord behind them are certainly less intelligent persons, although they may be advertised as great material scientists. Jyotishambho nishamshishtam vikurvad brahma vikshitam mahim gandha gunam adhat kala mayang shayogataha. Thereafter, the water produced from electricity was glanced over by the Supreme Personality of Godhead and mixed with eternal time and external energy. Thus, it was transformed into the earth, which is qualified primarily by smell. So, this is a reiteration of a sequence of things that are also mentioned in the second canto in 5th chapter. And this just shows the progression of how the material elements go from very subtle to gross. And what's interesting about this is that, as Prabhupada is pointing out here, that we start off with something that has the least amount of ability to be perceived by our senses. So we start off with the most subtle of the material elements, the gross material elements, that is, which is ether, or sky here it's called. So that sky has only one aspect, which is sound. And then we go to the next material element, which is air, which has sound and touch. And we go to the next one, which is, as Prabhupada explains here, form, or rather not form, but fire, which has sound, touch, and form. So as you see, as we're going down this unfolding cascade, that each successive thing has one more aspect that is accessible by our senses. So then we go to having taste, which water has. So water has sound, touch, taste, and form. But finally we get to earth, which has sound, form, taste, touch, and smell. So earth, or solid matter, has the availability to all of our senses. So the grossest thing is perceivable by all of our senses. The more subtle thing is hardly perceived by our senses at all. It's only perceived through sound. So this makes sense, if you think about it, that we live in a universe which is visible, and the usual word is palpable. The word palpable means to be presentable to the senses. Something's impalpable, the senses can't perceive it. So the things that we hold most real, or most tangible, again, palpable, tangible, real, these things seem to connote the same thing in our modern thinking, although they are not the same thing. These things are found or understood by its availability to all the senses, like this podium here. I can see it. If I knock on it, I can hear it. I can put my tongue on it and taste it. It won't have much of a taste. Might have some kind of a smell. Wood usually does have some kind of a smell. And so it's available to all my senses. And the world that we live in has most of these things around us like this. But what's being said in this statement here is gradually we fade into a world which is not perceivable to our senses. Like when we talk about kam, or here, there are different words being used. Nila, not Nila, but naba. Naba is another word for kam, or ether. And ether is not really directly perceivable by our senses. It is that thing which carries sound, or we could say radio waves. So from a more scientific perspective, we see that this ether carries sound, either directly as sound vibration or as electromagnetic radiation in the form of radio waves. So this transforms through the universe. And we see that there's a strange back and forth. We start off with shabda, which is touch. Sound. Shabda, which is sound. and sound generates ether. So a Tan-Matra, or a subtle sense object, generates the object, or the actual material essence, which in this case, or element we could call it. So the Tan-Matra, or subtle sense object, generates the gross thing, which is actually the element, which is known as ether. Then ether turns around and generates sparsha, which is touch. And touch then generates air, which in this group is called anila. So then anila turns around and generates rupa, which is form. And form then generates what we call fire. And in this group, it's tejasa, I think, is the word used for fire. Bhagavad Gita, they use different words, but these are the same concepts. And tejasa then goes back to the next thing which is generated, which is taste, which is rasa. And rasa generates water. And water then generates gandha, which is smell, and gandha generates finally earth, or bhumi. So in Bhagavad Gita we have bhumir apo nalo vayo kamana buddhir evacha hankara itiya mebina prakriti ashtada. These are Krishna's external energies. These are all part of the material energy. So what's interesting about creation is we see, as we've been talking about, things progress from what would be basically imperceptible to our senses to things that are much more perceptible and available to our senses. And this happens in a gradual unfolding process. And there was an interesting tape that I was just listening to yesterday from Sadaputta in his, explanation of the Big Bang. And he was talking about the idea of explanation. So the word to explain, he claims, is ex to mean out of, plain to make simple. So I haven't seen that the way it's glossed in Merriam-Webster or anything like that, but it gets across the basic concept of what you're doing when you explain something. You are trying to connect something which might be confusing or paradoxical or something that might seem esoteric to something that's actually very close to home. That's what we do when we explain. We try to take something that's a little remote in some way to connect it with something that's not so remote, something that's familiar. And this is why we are at a disadvantage and we have a lot of work to do as devotees, because everything that we can explain does not usually connect from the world that people know and remember and have been schooled in as they grew up, but it connects to a world that they're completely unfamiliar with. So to explain, this progression, we first have to explain these earth, water, fire, and ether. Then we have to explain the material world. Then we have to explain why the material world is different from the spiritual world. So you see that one explanation leads into yet another explanation, leads into yet another explanation, leads yet into another explanation. So this is where, as I see it, and one of the points that Sadaputta is making, that the Temple of Vedic Planetarium is designed with a feature of the material universe at its very core, the chandelier, the whole explanation of Bhumandala and all of its various aspects, which kind of is completely unfamiliar to Western people. Even to most Indians, it's unfamiliar, what to speak of Western people, in all of its detail. And of course, we don't see it in telescopes and all this kind of thing. However, this idea begins to make familiar as people come in contact with it. It will begin to make familiar this entire explanatory framework that we are looking at here in Srimad Bhagavatam. So we will learn about this, and there are many aspects of creation. I was just trying to do a quick inventory of them yesterday, of the different aspects of what we could talk about when we're talking about creation. And these are some of the things that's involved. We could talk about the creation of the avatars as they come from Krishna, particularly the Purusha avatars, how we have the expansion of first Mahavishnu, then into Garbha Vishnus, and then finally into Kshirodakshaya Vishnu. We could talk about the expansion of the universes from the breathing of Mahavishnu, how he breathes out. We could talk about the birth of Brahma, which is a completely different story, about how Brahma comes from the navel of Garbha Vishnu. And then we could talk about the energies, how one energy goes from another. And what's interesting is that later on we will hear how the Brahma Jyoti is different from the Pradhan. So Prabhupada in the purport tells us that the Brahma Jyoti has no three modes of nature, but the Pradhan does. However, in the Pradhan, the three modes of nature are not active. They are kind of equibalanced and not engaged in any kind of transformations. But when it moves to the third stage, which is the Mahatat, at that time, the three modes of nature become disequilibrium. They become in disequilibrium, and we begin to start the gestation of the entire material energy from that. Now, in many ways, you can't help it if you've actually been exposed to a lot of material science, that there are a lot of strange similarities in this, like measuring time with the atom, which both happens in the Bhagavatam and it happens in quantum physics, the idea that matter is not what it seems, which you hear both in Bhagavatam, and it's something that quantum physicists talk about. The material world has these strange elements, and that these huge, epochs of time, we call it yugas, and even beyond them, the, divya yugas and the kalpas and all that kind, these huge expanses of time, which also modern scientists talk about. So there are these points of tangency. There are also, of course, points of non-tangency, things where we disagree with the scientific viewpoint. So as we move forward, we can try to connect these things. And if you take nothing away from this whole explanation that we went over, the last 5 verses of this chapter 5 of the 3rd canto, you can just try to remember that gradually the material elements go from more ethereal to more tangible. That's what's happening. And I don't know why the word electricity was used here. Usually the word is fire or something like that. But here, for some reason, Jyotish was, glossed as electricity. Or we could say, if it's talking about the expansion of the Lord's energy, then it would be his Brahman potency. But for some reason, the word electricity got there, which kind of tends to throw the thing into a little bit of a confusing left field. But I just wanted to touch on that a bit. So, there are a lot of things that unfold in creation. You can see that the creation of the universe is not a straightforward or simple thing. It happens in a cascade of things, and it has many phases. And we learn also that sometimes these phases are not exactly in the same order. Or sometimes even it appears that some phases are left out for whatever reason. But in general, the idea is there. So similarly, if we were going to build, say, a shopping mall, we could talk about it from one perspective, if we were going to build a shopping mall, of how you get the land and you bring bulldozers in and you clear off a flat piece of territory, and then you put up some foundational structures, and then on it goes. The designs are there, and you build 2 or 3 floors, whatever it is, and then you put in the paving, and the fashion mall or the shopping mall is finished. So that's one way to look at it. Another way we could look at it is more on an abstract level of, first you have to have some people do research into where a shopping mall might be profitable. Then you have to do research of who owns the land and how much it would cost to buy, what the financing sources might be, what kind of businesses would do best there, and then you go through the architectural phase. So this is also building a shopping mall, but it would appear to be almost a completely different set of explanations than we just started with the bulldozers, you know. So both of these things are obviously there. And in the same way, the explanation of the expansion of the material universe is like this, that there is some more esoteric or abstract aspects of it, and then there's some very foundational, fairly straightforward mechanical aspects of it that are easier to grasp. So as we learn about this, we begin to not take the material universe so seriously. We begin to see that, in fact, it is a virtual world. So the scientists talk about atoms. Of course, now atoms are no longer seen as indivisible. Some time ago, it was discovered that there was atoms and then electrons on the outside, and some other kinds of particles that sometimes float around. But even further now, they've gone into discussing things called quarks and things like that are constituents further in. But ultimately, when you ask a scientist, what is an atom? Or what is an electron? What are these particles? The explanation ends there. You know, you can't get further in. We go one step further. We say they are energies of God. And because they're energies of God, that means they can do anything. However, the Supreme Lord has them follow certain stable and predictable qualities. And this is what the scientists are comfortable with, these stable and predictable qualities. So like a virtual reality, things do more or less follow the stable, predictable, scientifically accessible program of happening. But everywhere in those less tangible spaces, as we get out to the fuzzy, external, not so perceivable aspects of our universe, strange things are going on. You know, all kinds of carnival activities are taking place out there. And the scientists, at least the hardcore, hard-nosed, materialistic, atheistic scientists, completely pretend that none of that stuff exists. They have to. Because if they admit any of this stuff, then it leads the way, as they would call it, into the woo-woo territory, which is, you know, where we have to talk about these subtle things, the spirit, and we have beyond our 8, you know, elements. I mean, our 5 basic elements: Bhumir, Apo, Analo, and Vayu. We have beyond them these subtle elements, you know, Manas, Buddhi, and Ahankara. So these are not going to be measured by any scientific instruments, at least the ones that we have today. So the scientists completely are in the dark about the 3 subtle elements. You know, the element of Buddhi, intelligence, Manas, mind, and Ahankara, false ego. But this is the constituent parts of the subtle body, which carries the self from one body to another. And this is what makes a living entity different from a dead one. And those scientists who want to show that life is just a collection of elements, just matter, gross elements, then they will never be able to account for life, because without taking into account these three subtle things, buddhi, manas, and ahankara, you can't explain life and why it causes matter to arrange in very strange ways. We can see quite simply from a medical point of view that at the point of death, so many chemical reactions stop happening. The immune system stops to function in short order. The Krebs cycle, all these other things. There's so many different things going on in the body. These chemical reactions, suddenly they just stop going on, and invasive bacteria and animals and insects begin to invade the body, and the body doesn't mind anymore, doesn't fight them even slightly. And this all happens very quickly because the subtle aspects, the subtle body has left the gross body, and therefore the gross body no longer performs these, circus, dogs jumping through flaming hoops backwards, and elephants standing on their back legs, and, clowns coming out of cars, and all this. If you actually look at what's going on in a cell, it is so bizarre that it amazes me how anyone can look at that and think that it all happened by chance. The more you learn about it, the more bizarre it is. It's just so intricate. But at any rate, the point here is that creation proceeds from various stages, and at each stage it sets the table for the next stage to take place. And there are, sometimes it's listed, and we'll see that that's described later on in the 20th chapter of this canto, that there are 9 creations. And the first half section is called Prakriti creation, which means that it's conducted by the Supreme Lord himself. And then that goes all the way up until stage 6. And then 7, 8, 9 are what are called Vikrita creation, which means they are conducted by Lord Brahma. So we have 6 beginning stages of creation, where we have the generation of these elements, the kind of things we're hearing about now, and these are all mostly handled by the Supreme Lord. And it's only in stage 7 where Brahma takes over and begins to put these things together. It's like in our shopping mall example, now from Lowe's and various other supply sources, we've got all the lumber and the I-beams and the concrete and the tiling and the wire and the rebar and all that sitting there. But Brahma's the one that starts to say, okay, put that over there and put this over here, pour that first, and then we're going to put this, and we're going to go next, and then next. So this is how it works. And then Brahma has the difficult task of then creating the bodies of the living entities. The elements are all there. They are assembled during the Prakriti Sarga, or the creation by the Supreme Lord. And then Brahma takes over in the Vikrita Sarga, which is the creation by Brahma subsequent. So this is a kind of an overview. I wanted to leave plenty of time because I can see the sign here that I am keeping you over time for prasadam, and this is not good. So I will try to remedy this, and I'll cut it at this point and leave some time for questions, and we'll see if we can end on time. Or at least if we don't end on time, I will have released you by that time, and anybody who stays behind can explain that they voluntarily stayed beyond prasadam time, and that I did not keep them longer than necessary. Okay, so any questions from what we've discussed today? There's so much to talk about when you discuss these things. Yes. Do we have our, yeah, good.
Do you have your microphone?
Yeah, I've got the second microphone over there. It's recording. It's not, it's already recording.
Oh,
It's taking a feed out of the mixing deck.
So, thank you for the nice class, Maharaj. My question is that the Vedic picture is very clear that the gross elements come from the subtle elements, but now we see in the modern world it's exactly opposite. And then and it's even not so easy to convince others that it is that we are right and their picture is not right. So I was thinking, what is the evidence? You gave that example of the shopping mall, but do you have more evidence that actually the gross elements come from the subtle elements, and that it does not make sense to assume that the subtle come from the gross?
Right. Which is interesting. You've hit on one of the striking differences between the Vedic picture and the modern picture, what I'll call our 21st century mythology. So our 21st century mythology is based on a bottom-up universe, and we're based on a top-down universe. So as Sariputta was mentioning in his talk, that the first thing is the most complex thing that could ever be, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. You can't get any more complex than that. And so the Supreme Lord is far more complex than anything else we could talk about. So when we talk about our explanations, we finally wind them up with the Supreme Lord, which, the scientists don't want to go there. So how do they build a picture? They have to go from bottom up. Their idea is that by simple chemical and physical constraints that are there inherently in matter, the whole universe will come about on its own. It doesn't need a creator. It doesn't need an architect. It doesn't need any builders or shingle layers or grouters or any of those other kind of things. It just happens on its own. And that's the picture they're trying to present. This is a ridiculous picture, by the way, because if you really look at the complexity of what's going on, it beggars belief that people can believe that just by simple things. I mean, the whole Big Bang concept. That there was a singularity, and it was a point, and it exploded. Of course, we can't answer the question of what happened before that. Was there something else that existed before that? And then it goes out, and it becomes this huge cloud of dust, but it clumps in some ways. And now in cosmology, the question is, well, why should it clump in some ways? But evidently it does, and you get dust, and that dust collects into big balls, and those big balls become suns, and they throw off some stuff, and that becomes planets. And then somehow or other, these elements are churning around on some planetary surface, and some electricity from a lightning bolt happens, and it pulls together some amino acids in a very odd way, and suddenly life jump starts. And then we've got DNA. I mean, this picture is like one of those connect the dots. I don't know if you've all seen those, but as kids, many times they have these sort of connect the dot drawings where you have like these little dots, and then you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And as a kid, you draw from one dot to the next dot. And when you finish, you realize it's an elephant, or it's a clown, or, maybe it's a baby shark or something like that, but when these dots are so far away from one another, it's hard to know which way to connect them, and that's the issue. Of course, we also don't have all the stuff in the middle of these dots either, because whether you're talking about the scientific view or the Vedic picture, we can't fill in all the spaces either. You know, it's not possible. The universe is just too complex for that. However, the, I think, selling point of the Vedic system is that it touches more aspects of the reality that people really do go out there and experience every day, far more than what the scientific picture does. And I think over time, those scientists who have to put up their, police tape, don't go here, don't go there, we don't believe in this doesn't work, we can't talk about that. Eventually, I think even now already, people are getting very tired of that, and it's unreasonable. If you're going to be a scientist, you have to investigate things. You can't just put your police tape up and say, wave a hand and say that doesn't exist. We don't believe. We have true believers, you have true disbelievers, So they are born again disbelievers, and so in time that approach is wearing thin on people, I think. So that's how it's going to work. So as I was saying, they paint a bottom-up picture, which small, Lego building blocks are supposed to knock together by forces we don't understand exactly, and it creates eventually, cows and horses and planetary systems and human substructures and the whole thing. Somehow it's supposed to come out of that. Not very plausible. On the other side of the coin, a top-down picture explains that we are in a virtual reality. Someone outside of the virtual reality, in the actual reality, is creating this reality. And he's made it plastic so that it does things in certain ways most of the time, but if he wants it to do things in some other way, it does. And all around the fuzzy edges of our world that seems to be dictated by scientific formulae, funny things are going on, clowns are jumping out of cars and, various other hijinks are going on. And a lot of people can't help but notice these other things. The other thing is, of course, that they believe in the laws as the ultimate thing, and we believe in the law giver. That's another fundamental difference. So for them, the laws are the last word. And that's why they're so strong on these laws and constants of nature. Because the human mind has to have something to hold on to. So if you can't hold on to the lawgiver, you have to hold on to the law. And we say that yes, the laws are there, but they're made by a lawgiver, and if he wants, he can revoke or amend them or bypass them if he wants to for a certain period of time. So that's another fundamental difference between the modern 21st century mythology and the Vedic picture. We also say that we take from authority. We're not empirically trying to understand how the world works. Of course, to some extent that's warranted, but we are actually fundamentally understanding the big picture from a passed down explanation, which is what the Vedas are. They are template, there are basic explanation for what's going on here. Let's see if anybody else has any. Yes.
One key difference is that the scientists, they hypothesis that consciousness is a product of matter, where we say that matter is a product of consciousness.
Right, that's another big difference.
For me, it's like the Vedic literature provides a whole theory of consciousness that there's some empirical evidence that supports, whereas there isn't any really empirical evidence that shows you can take unconscious things and subject them to chemical, physical, or nuclear, reactions and produce a conscious thing. So it's a big weakness. Whereas there's like empirical evidence for like in reincarnation and out-of-body experiences that the consciousness can function without.
That's where they put the police tape. You can't go there. Woo! You can't go there. It's illegal. Because if you go there, then we have to investigate that data. So we just pretend it doesn't exist. There's absolutely, they claim that matter creates life, but no one's ever been able to show that or anything like it. They claim that consciousness is an epiphenomenon of neural, mental, or brain activity. No one has any experiment that demonstrates that. They claim that the universe came about as a result of natural clumping by natural forces. Of course, no one's been able to demonstrate that either. So all these things are articles of faith. And the real, elephant in the room is that because scientists have put so much police tape on so many different areas of the world that we actually live in, that they are stumped and they have no explanation for consciousness. That's the one thing that if you look at the modern in scientific investigation of consciousness, you'll find at least 20 different schools that are all saying completely different things, all the way from it doesn't exist to, all sorts of other things. So the clock on the wall is right up, and I have my video here to prove that exactly at 9 o'clock I have indeed terminated this class. So, any rate, thank you all very much for your kind attention. All glories to Srimad Bhagavatam. All glories to the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord. Hare Krishna.